So first of all, I want to give a pep talk. You only have about 3 months till the WTO is here. I know that people work very hard on their own causes, but you have an historical role here. And if you don't do something about the WTO, you're going to have to do a lot of work over the coming years. So why don't you put in the effort now? This is a little pitch. Help Sally out, because she's working like a maniac all the time. So I hope I'm not trying to get blood out of a stone here, but if people can put in that extra push, it would certainly help the people of the world out. And so Seattle has a particular role to play. And I think just the fact that it's Sunday, it's 6 o'clock, and you're all here is a really good indication of what's possible. So I really appreciate that everybody came out. Now, how many people have heard of the MAI? Because I just want to get a sense of my audience here. So pretty well everybody, okay. Because what I'm going to try and do is something that I've done with groups in Canada, and people are always at all kinds of different levels on these issues. So unfortunately, some of this is going to be policy wonk stuff. It's going to be recorded, and it's going to union people who will have to take it up in terms of applying this agreement to their own circumstances. So I'm sorry if it's a lot of detail here. I came along with handouts. Everything I'm saying you can pick up. If you're an organization, you can put your own stamp on it and put it out as your own stuff. There's no intellectual property rights in this room. So as Sally mentioned, I work with the Council of Canadians, but that's just one of the many groups that I work with. And just before, when we were waiting in the audience, I was telling someone that my last job was working for the government of British Columbia on an explicitly anti-MAI project. What I did was I worked with different sectors, like seniors, cultural groups, environmental groups, labor, municipalities, analyzing what the MAI would do to their sector. And he expressed surprise that a government would do that. But I think we have to expand our imagination about what we should expect from governments, because why wouldn't a government help its people understand these agreements? So after I finished working on this project for the BC government, I continued to work with groups on a freelance basis, partly because once you get into trade and investment negotiation issues, it's hard to turn to anything else. It just seems so incredible what they're doing. But also because I came across documents that seem to tell me in a very explicit way where the MAI is going. And I think the MAI is going into something called the General Agreement on Trade and Services. I'd like to see a show of hands if anybody's ever heard of that. Okay. Well, that's good. That's more than your politicians, probably. Some people are blaming me here in the audience. So to give some backing on that, I'm going to quote this guy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also a fellow at the Brookings Institution. He came to our WTO hearings in Canada, and he said, and so here's a real broad clue about where the MAI is going from somebody who should know. Absent the attempt to integrate a comprehensive set of disciplines on investment into the WTO, in other words, they don't think it's possible because of people like you that'll oppose it. They're not going to come out with another MAI that's explicitly called an MAI at the WTO because you'd be on them too hard. So instead, he thinks that the looming investment agenda in Geneva offers a lot of scope for moving forward on investment in ways that are of use both to investors and to host countries. And I would surmise that the negotiations that are about to resume under the General Agreement on Trade and Services offer quite significant potential for achieving that objective. So what this policy wonk guy, who's from Harvard, says is that the MAI is going to the WTO through the negotiations on services. So we should take our hints from this guy. They keep dropping really broad clues about what they're doing, and I think we should pay attention. So what is the General Agreement on Trade and Services? The GATS is an existing agreement that is administered by the WTO. I want to emphasize that it's an existing agreement. It's not something that may or may not be signed in the future. It already exists. All the most powerful clauses that we worried about in the MAI, the stuff that doesn't let people gain from foreign investment in their country, the stuff that makes it apply to every level of government, federal, state, county, and even to non-governmental organizations. This is all in the GATS already. This is how the WTO promotes the GATS on its own website. So for me, this is clue number 2. The GATS is the first multilateral agreement to provide legally enforceable rights to trade in all services. It has a built-in commitment to continuous liberalization through periodic negotiations. I just want to stop there. That's what I call the Energizer Bunny clause, because it'll just keep going and going and going until they've liberalized and privatized everything. Okay? So that's built right into the agreement, that they're going to keep meeting and they're going to keep liberalizing all services. And people can say, well, so what? What's a service? Pretty much everything is a service. The only thing, they define service in sort of a flip way by saying that anything that you can't drop on your foot is a service, okay? And again, in the WTO's own words, the GATS is the world's first multilateral agreement on investment. We should dummy up here. This is what they're saying. The WTO is saying that the GATS is the first multilateral agreement on investment, since it covers not just cross-border trade, but every possible means of supplying a service, including the right to set up a commercial presence in the export market. So I want to tell you what that'll mean for Canadians. I think Canadian Studies here is partly sponsoring this, so I'll throw in a little application to the Canadian situation. For Canadians, it would mean the death of Medicare. With these provisions in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, as applied to health care, it would destroy Canadian Medicare. And that's because our system is based on health care provision by nonprofits. You cannot be a private corporation and deliver hospital services in Canada. Yeah, I think it's really good. Universal Medicare could not work with the high costs inflicted on health care by private corporations. It just wouldn't work. In order for Medicare to survive at all, everybody has to stay in the same health care boat, which means that you cannot have private corporations coming in, taking the cream out of the system, which would be wealthy people going to get premium care at private clinics. And why that is, just in practical terms, is that wealthy people, if they're paying the money to get good care, why are they going to turn around and fund a universal Medicare system? They figure that they're being taxed twice. So that's just the practical way of how Medicare would be taken down. If Canada agrees to having the GATS apply to health care, then foreign corporations are given the automatic, guaranteed right to set up within our territory. And that means that we could not sustain a public health care system like we have now. Now, when a former assistant to the U.S. Trade Representative gave a paper to the Brookings Institute this summer, and he just made a sweeping statement. He just said quite categorically that overregulation and restrictions on entry by foreign service providers inevitably result in low quality, high cost, and outdated services. This is the mentality, that that everybody knows this and it's unquestionable. So he makes a sweeping statement that entry by foreign service providers is automatically a good thing. Well, this is demonstrably false in the case of Canadian Medicare. By restricting entry of foreign private medical services into Canada, we've been able to keep our healthcare costs down. We actually spend less per capita than you do in the US, and we have universal coverage. So foreign entry by private multinationals would not be to the benefit of the average Canadian. But this is the mentality of people who work within the trade, within trade departments. It's just, the ideology is absolutely firm. They have no questions about the things that they say. But the guaranteed rights the General Agreement on Trade and Services gives to foreign service providers, what's called the National Treatment Provisions. Ring any bells for anybody? MAI, National Treatment. Can't distinguish between a domestic and a foreign supplier of a service. Perhaps more than any other agreement that is supposed to be about trade, the GATS is far more than this. It is a privatization agreement. It is a deregulation agreement. Rather than its current name, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, it should really be called the General Agreement on the Privatization of Everything, or maybe the General Agreement on Eliminating All Regulation for Everybody. So there's two. Somebody probably could come up with a nifty little acronym for it. I couldn't come up with something that actually fit, but this is an agreement that goes by a false name. It's not about trade. It's about how you rule your own communities. And you see this, I'm going to go into what's exactly in it, and this, I hope I don't lose people here. There is a clause, so if you go to the WTO site, you can actually read this thing. It's sitting right there. It's not that hard to understand in comparison with the MAI.
What is that site?
WTO, www.wto.org. I go to it all the time. It's, and you can just read the agreement right there. So again, it's not something that may or may not happen. This is sort of like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. It's got a clause in there that might reassure you. It says it doesn't apply to anything that's done in the exercise of governmental authority, which sort of sounds like it protects public services, right? Nothing done in the exercise of governmental authority. But they've written clauses into this that make it useless. Anything done in the exercise of governmental authority, but anything that is done as on a commercial basis is no longer done in the exercise of governmental authority. So why would that be a problem? All kinds of public services now are turning to fee-for-service, right? Libraries, you can probably think of some other examples where public services start to charge. So would they be considered in the public sector or not? They probably wouldn't. Another huge, huge problem with this clause is that it does exempt public services except where there are private competitors. There's private... Good. This is a very smart crowd. Why is that a problem? You have private competitors to public schools. You have private competitors anywhere in your territory, anywhere within the US of A, where you have a private supplier of the service, then they're in competition. So, for example, there are people running private library systems in the United States. So your public libraries, the Seattle Public Library is still a public library, huh? Oh, good. Well, anyway, I can count on a few things. In some places it isn't. It's being, in some states they're having their libraries run by private corporations. So anyways, I can just imagine the trade lawyers looking at this and going, oh, goody, this is great. We can just use this one and do challenge after challenge to public services. There are two key parts of the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which tell governments what they can and cannot do quite independently of foreign trade considerations. So even if even if Canada or Germany or whoever, Malaysia, is not banging on your door wanting access to your market, you still have to revise your regulations. You kind of go, well, wait a minute, this is supposed to be about trade. This is supposed to be the World Trade Organization. So if you don't have any traders interested in coming into your market, why do you have the WTO telling you what to do in Seattle or King County generally? Like, why? How do they have the nerve, you could ask. You can just see them having this little trade window, and they reach through and they pull everything through it. So everything becomes trade-related, okay? One policy wonk said it's tangentially related. So when they call it the TRIPS agreement, they really mean, rather than trade-related, they mean tangentially related to trade. So there's two big provisions. One's just straight up front called domestic regulation. A whole section in the GATS telling what you can and cannot do with domestic regulation. Talk about in your face, right? There they are. So you come under a WTO magnifying glass. And any corporation, be it domestic or foreign, can demand to go before an appeal board, which your governments have to set up for this purpose. And it has to be independent of your politicians. And then they can challenge anything that has not been done in a reasonable, objective, and impartial manner. Well, if you look at everything from the perspective of enhancing trade or enhancing commerce, a lot of things that governments do can look pretty impartial, like saving the environment or little things like that could look pretty unobjective and not reasonable. So under this agreement, your domestic regulation, not your trade regulations, your domestic regulation, you have to reform it, you have to create a vehicle that private corporations can come and challenge all your laws. Under licensing, the domestic regulation provisions mean that once a sector like health or education are committed to be covered by the GATS, then the WTO sets up a body to determine whether or not the way you license your planners, your doctors, your nurses, your librarians is a barrier to trade. Okay? It will be their call whether or not the licensing for your doctors in Seattle has been set too high. Okay? Somebody should talk to the American Medical Association about this stuff. And anything that is looked on as more burdensome, again in the eyes of the WTO, than required to ensure the quality of a service can be struck down. So this is quite amazing that all of our professionals will be judged by a panel set up by the WTO to see whether or not these licenses are what they call a barrier to trade. A barrier to trade is anything that limits the service. So if you have high standards, you're limiting the number of doctors, and that is a barrier. Well, it's a barrier to high standards, I guess, but it's also, in the view of the WTO, excessively high standards are considered a barrier to trade, so it would be a no-no. Unlike goods, so I guess I'm making a pitch to say this is even worse than the other stuff. Unlike trade in goods, services, you usually have contact between the consumer and the producer of the service, okay? You take a cab, you deal with the cab driver, right? So you're in communication. Trade in goods can go right across borders. So all the stuff usually that they do in trade agreements deals with that stuff when it comes across borders, like customs, like tariffs. But again, in this way of reaching through the window and pulling your whole society through it, they're saying that domestic regulation can be a barrier when you look at that consumer and service provider relationship, because it limits the number of service providers. And this is according to one GATS expert. The GATS recognizes that trade and services can be hampered either by discriminatory regulatory requirements imposed only on foreign service providers, or by restrictive regulations that are imposed on both domestic and foreign services. So do people get what they're doing here? They're all of a sudden moving right into regulating what you do with your domestic service suppliers. The new round of negotiation on trade and services has to be seen as a key event in facilitating domestic reform of regulatory systems. So, again, a really big hint here, what they're doing, okay? Doesn't have to have anything to do with trade. They just can move in and set these international agreements on services so that you have to reform your local regulations. And remember, it applies to federal, state, county, anybody who has delegated authority from government. So that would include NGOs that administer grants. This is pretty sweeping. So I'll try and give a concrete example. There are a lot of private health corporations worldwide, some of them in Germany, that are looking for places to invest. A German hospital could come into Seattle, and they would have the guaranteed right to set up here, right? It's the first clause in the agreement. So if a German corporation wanted to establish a hospital in Seattle and run it with cheap help, with doctors who, did marginally in some med school somewhere that you don't recognize, and underqualified nurses. And the local authorities objected, saying you're not meeting high enough standards. The German government could take a complaint to the WTO on behalf of this private hospital, saying that your local authorities were imposing qualifications that are more burdensome than necessary to ensure the quality of the service. Okay? You can tell where corporations are going with this. The U.S. Coalition of Service Industries, which includes Aetna, the healthcare giant, has asked the U.S. government to have the GATS negotiations address the problems, I put problems in quotation marks here, of restricted licensing of healthcare professionals and excessive, what they would call excessive, privacy and confidentiality regulations. Do you know where your medical files are right now? Okay. Trade in healthcare services and records is huge. Databases get sold to drug companies, and all of a sudden you get a message on your email saying, go with this drug company, right? So access to your healthcare data is a really, really powerful thing, and they're going for it. So they could, under the GATS, if healthcare gets covered, go after the privacy of healthcare records, saying it's excessive and it's a barrier to trade. So I hope I've got your attention. Another big hint, and this is what the Coalition on Service Industries has asked Charlene Berszewski, your trade negotiator, to get out of this round of negotiations. And she asked them to tell her what they wanted. So you got to believe that she's listening. In addition, the agreement says you have to allow, so you've got foreign service companies allowed to establish in Seattle. They have a guaranteed right to be here, and they have a guaranteed right to challenge if you set too high qualifications. The other aspects of this agreement are what's called consumption abroad, which means me as a consumer going abroad to get a service. Which doesn't seem so terrible, but I'll get into it. The other way is to have foreign service providers given an automatic right to come to your country, to the United States, and deliver the service. Okay? One of the most avid American promoters of free trade, Jagdish Bhagwati, in an article entitled "Free Trade Can Cut Healthcare Costs," has said, "There is clearly tremendous potential to lower medical costs by importing more foreign doctors and exporting more patients." Now, he doesn't mean exporting them like never bringing them back, okay? He means exporting them in terms of them doing this consumption abroad of the service. Yeah, I guess if you exported all your sick people, I guess you'd save on healthcare. Never thought of it that way. He recommends that the U.S. issue temporary visas to foreign doctors whose ability to practice would be judged not by your local authorities, but because he views these as tainted with vested interests, right? But by international bodies concerned about freeing up trade. So Bhagwati says, and remember, you can't, you think, oh, well, we just go crazy and we get that overturned, but this is the WTO, right? There's nothing that's ever been overturned, so people just don't take on the WTO because the sanctions that they can authorize are hundreds of millions of dollars each year, plus all the trade retaliation. So you just don't take on these guys. Bhagwati says another way to lower costs is to take patients to where the cheaper health services are, pointing out that open heart surgery costs 1/10 if it's delivered in India than if it's carried out in the United States. Of course, people can already fly abroad if they want to. People do it all the time to get whatever surgery they want. A lot of people come to the States. But this could be enforced on your public healthcare systems. So Medicaid, for example, could possibly be forced to make patients cross the border, presumably to Mexico, if cheaper treatments were available. So that's one of the ways you can think that consumption abroad would come back to bite you. The whole idea of exporting patients and importing, these guys are so fixed on trade, they forget that these are sick people we're talking about, You don't want them flying off all over the world, coming home. It's just kind of a wild perspective, but again, it's what you get into if you see everything through the lens of trade. The other huge part of the GATS that, again, reaches right into Seattle and tells you what to do is the market access provisions. A former assistant to the U.S. Trade Representative says, the GATS article on market access extends beyond traditional concerns of access for foreign service suppliers to encompass all policies which restrict access to a market. This is a major, thank you for that, this is a major extension of multilateral trade disciplines into the realm of domestic policy. And this guy actually supports it, right? He thinks this is good. But, again, we have to listen to what these people are saying. He views the GATS negotiations as, I guess, an opportunity. We might see it as a threat. To create a major extension of multilateral trade disciplines into the realm of domestic policy. Now, as an outside observer, it seems to me that one of the problems Americans are facing is not that they have an overregulated service sector. 74% of Americans work in the service sector, and that's partly because free trade has hammered you and made you lose a lot of manufacturing jobs. So again, when we're talking about the significance of services and going, oh, so what's a service? It's like dry cleaning. No, it's 74% of what people do for a living in the United States. And people who work in the service industry tend to work very long hours. They work beyond, because they're often not salaried employees. They often work at home. So a study that was recently published by the International Labor Organization showed that American workers are just completely overworked. People feel tired. There is a reason for that. American workers are just putting in huge, long hours, long work weeks. 1/5 of all Americans now work more than 49 hours a week. Okay? So this is a demand in the 19th century to get an 8-hour week, 40-hour week, an 8-hour day. And we sort of retreated quite a bit from that. So now Americans are working 9 weeks longer annually on average than the average European worker. So that's, you think about what you could do with 9 weeks over the year. Spend more time with your kids or whatever, get involved in more civic stuff. It's just horrendous. And in the American context, since 1979, American workers are working 2 months longer per year than they were doing in 1979. So one of the things that Americans identify when they say, what's my biggest problem, they sometimes talk about what's happening to their families and the lack of time they have for their families. And you can see that this completely unregulated sector, where people just work like dogs around the clock sometimes when they've got rush projects, maybe a cut in those hours that they have to work would be good, maybe some regulation. In France, for example, where productivity is actually higher than, the productivity gains in France are actually higher than in the United States. They're enforcing a 35-hour work week. I just think how nice that would be. Anyways. So basically, again, to emphasize, you don't have to have any corporation banging at your door to have to reform your regulations if your government accepts to have your sectors covered by the GATS. That's why I think the name General Agreement on Trade and Services is so misleading. One of the articles under market access says that governments cannot discriminate against a service supplier on the basis of what kind of legal entity it is. Again, this is sort of the old boring trade language that puts everybody off. Well, what's an illegal entity? That's a public institution, or it's a wholly owned subsidiary from Germany, or it's a nonprofit. Governments are not allowed under the GATS to make a distinction. So, subsidies are covered. You give a subsidy to a library, can that be contested under the GATS? They apply this provision that you're not allowed to discriminate. And I love it when they borrow our language. They say discriminate is a bad thing. Giving preference to nonprofit institutions should not have a nasty word like discrimination attached to it. It should be something like promote or, value public nonprofit institutions. But instead, we don't want to discriminate in favor of them. So subsidies are covered. I don't know if people work for the public sector here, but think about your libraries and think about, let me think, any kind of public daycare, if you've got preferences for nonprofit daycares, that kind of thing. Oh yeah, that's a big one. Forgot about the judicial system. Okay. So here's another sort of concrete example of how the GATS would affect a specific sector. And in case, I always have to, I've worked with these very, very good people within the British Columbia government. And they were sympathetic to making sure that people understood how bad things would be, but they also always warned me about being alarmist. You don't want to overstate your case. You want to be accurate in this stuff. But every time, I think, well, maybe I'm being alarmist, I go and read the stuff on the World Trade Organization site. And it's just incredible. I mean, they will say just flat out that there's positive trends because things are being privatized. They just say that as though everyone is on board with this analysis. The WTO just last year put out a contract, it's a contract on higher education. They led a contract to a private firm to do a study on higher education. And this firm just scoured the globe to find any example anywhere of regulation or a measure that would impede trade in higher education. And the organization that they gave it to was something called the Global Alliance for Transnational Education. I always think of the Dave Barry term. I am not making this up, but I mean, it's just... So the Global Alliance for Transnational Education gets the study. It puts up on its website, I think it's still up there, asking people to send in email messages ratting on their own governments. Is there any example in your country of a restrictive practice that gives preference to local institutions, right? And it tells people that they can do this anonymously, but reassures them that they are not committing treason by saying this. Again, I am not making this up. You can go to this website and read this tonight. Anyways, I guess some of us could dispute that, when citizens are actively solicited to report on their own governments in favor of international corporations. So some examples of the nasty things he's looking for are laws limiting degrees to be conferred only by or through national universities. I don't know if that applies in the US. We'd have to talk about that later. Policies or laws discriminating against private institutions of higher education. So again, governments could not give a preferential subsidy to a public higher education institution or a college. And that would have huge ramifications in Canada. And policies which do not fully recognize foreign educational credentials. And again, you just have to sort of think through the implications of what that would mean in terms of American policy. So anyways, if the GATS is so bad, why haven't I heard about it? Okay, that's... If it's so alarming, why don't we know? Well, you could say because the new media will never tell you about it, but, they didn't tell us about the MAI either. And there have been some disputes that have gone to the WTO under the Agreement on Trade and Services. One of them was the banana dispute. Anybody heard of that? Where the U.S., this is a great crowd, the U.S. government on behalf of Chiquita and Del Monte challenged European efforts to promote banana growers in the Caribbean. That was a GATS dispute. The other one was our poor little attempt in Canada to preserve 3% of our magazine market for our own magazines. We're so pushy in Canada, We're just right out there. Anyways, that was struck down too, and that was under the General Agreement on Trade and Services. But now the ante is being upped in a massive, sweeping way. In order to get any agreement whatsoever, because understandably, a lot of countries that are only aspiring to have public services didn't want to sign an agreement on trade and services that would just preempt any hope they ever had towards industrialized nations' kind of regulation and lifestyle and all the things that we enjoy. I mean, this would just cut it right off at the pass. So third world countries and developing nations in particular were very reluctant to sign. The US got them to sign by saying you just have to put forward the things you want to put forward. So a lot of people just put forward luxury hotels. They don't care about them. They could do whatever they want. So luxury hotels were covered. And they also said you don't have to have the whole of the agreement apply. Even if you put forward something like luxury hotels, maybe you don't have one of the provisions apply, like foreign service workers being able to work at the hotel. So it was very non-threatening for people to sign on to this thing and not worry about it. Well, now they're changing. They want to change the way the agreement is negotiated from this piecemeal thing where you put something in and you sort of take it back, to putting everything, all 160 sectors, on the table at the same time. Okay? So that, I'm going to give you a quote from a guy who actually has a pivotal role in coming up with the draft agreements for this kind of stuff. His name's Rolf Adlon. He works for the WTO's Services Division. And what he says about how great it would be just to put everything on the table at the same time is he says, in particular, it could help to include countries, measures and sectors which, reflecting lack of interest on the part of the larger players, have hitherto eluded, running away, elude these people, have hitherto eluded significant reform, or at least bindings. The onus would be on the domestic interest group, seeking to avoid liberalization, thus reducing the burdens on administrations to cajole them into participation. See how efficient this is, you know? Basically, this might prove particularly difficult in areas such as health and education. And again, I'm not making this up. I can send you the paper where he said this. So you can see how efficient a change in the negotiating, from just putting one thing forward at a time, each country doing that, to putting all the 160 sectors on the table at once. Rather than politicians having to muck around and actually consult with people and consult with sectors and the general public about whether a particular service should be subjected to the GATS, you get all sectors on the table at once, and then groups and countries have to scramble to get services they care about protected. Since there are 160 sectors potentially covered by the agreement, everything from park maintenance to university education to sewer and water services, everything being up for grabs at once would be a monumental challenge to groups and unions trying to protect the public interest. Now, Adlon borrows a very interesting image. Ulysses tying himself to the mast to avoid being called off course by the sirens, okay? Now this is, so a WTO official is saying the good thing about the GATS is that, like the Ulysses myth, and maybe I'll just explain that a bit for those of you who slept through classical Greek mythology in high school. This is one of the trials of Ulysses, right? He's going back, he's sailing, trying to get home to Ithaca after he's finished sacking Troy, which was the city, not the Star Trek character, okay? Okay, so anyways, he's on his way and he faces a whole bunch of different trials and tribulations. One of them is he has to pass the island where the sirens live. And the sirens are sea nymphs, and they sing so sweetly that they draw sailors off course and they founder on the rocks, okay? So Ulysses' task was, how do I pass the sirens without going off course and having my ship break up and everybody die? So the solution was, he had his crew bind him to the mast of his ship, and his crew stopped their ears with beeswax, okay, so they couldn't hear the call of the sirens. Now this is the analogy that a top WTO official says is what the advantage of the WTO is. He says that governments are like Ulysses, being bound to the mast of the ship of state so that they can avoid hearing what he calls the interest groups from citizens calling him off course, calling these governments off course. Okay? I just find it an absolutely astonishing anti-democratic image. He even says later on in his paper that sometimes governments sign things, and I had an interesting talk with Maria just before we began. Sometimes governments sign things and they don't understand the full implications. They don't understand how strong the bindings are going to be. Well, Mr. Adlung thinks this is a good thing because sometimes WTO unelected, secretive dispute panels interpret these agreements far beyond what the elected representatives of governments intended. He thinks this is a good thing. These are the people who work for the World Trade Organization. If you think you're going to get justice for labor or for the environment out of these people, I think you're looking in the wrong place. But let's look at this image from a democratic perspective. Politicians are allowing themselves to be bound, and they actually use this language in trade circles. These are bindings. Governments are going to be disciplined. It all sounds sort of sadomasochistic, actually. There's a clause in the GATS called the gods, and you're actually supposed to follow the disciplines under the gods. You know, it's all. I mean, it would be hard to satirize if it wasn't true. So you have these bindings where politicians are not supposed to, and they call us interest groups. You know, labor, the environment, we're all interest groups that call governments off course. So in other words, citizens. The citizens are calling governments off course. We're not even considered to be on the ship of state. We're on this island. We are like the other. People have studied literary theory. We're like the other. We're faceless. We're dangerous. We're calling governments off course to their deaths. And the only thing governments can do, not to respond to our sweet songs, and maybe these are sweet songs about universal health care, maybe they're sweet songs about good public services or more equality and more justice. But governments are bound by the WTO not to listen to us. And then we can look at the crew. Anybody got some ideas about who the crew might be? This is actually a really good tool for workshops, and I brought copies with me. People want to use it. Again, there's no intellectual property rights on this stuff. So who could the crew be? Maybe the crew. Well, they usually don't work. They don't do the work. Other people do the work, like Nike. Charlene Bershevsky, trade representatives, like it's. Yeah. You could think of these, this crew that has stopped up its ears not to listen to us as being the people who are supposed to be representing us at these trade negotiations. It would be Charlene Barshevsky for you, Leon Britton for the Europeans, and our guy, Sergio Marchi, for Canadians. So they're rowing away and they're not listening to us, right? And they've bound our political leaders with these trade agreements. So no matter what kind of sweet, enticing songs we're singing, they're not going to listen to us. And so they've got their ears blocked with beeswax, which you know might be neoliberal ideology, maybe. You can just there's lots of things you can do with this image. And maybe the image, rather than the way Adlung uses it, we can start sort of looking at it as what the challenge is before us. That we need people to represent us at these trade negotiations who will truly listen to us and represent our interests, or maybe we'll stop the boat. And maybe we need to elect politicians who are not eager to be bound up in this way and who are actually interested in governing. Well, that's a concept, eh? Maybe then we could see the ship of state heading in the direction of the public interest.
Well, thank you. I needed that. When you run for office, especially if you really believe, not really in holding the office, but in doing something with it, and if you're related to a cause, and if everything you do is related to causes, and if they're good causes, then the elections take on something a lot more than just whether you win the election or not. It has to do with being able to keep on the battle. First of all, I'm glad you're here. It's a beautiful summer or early fall, and it's the fact that you're here and you're interested and you're wanting to be involved in the details and that you care and that you have the background that you do puts you at the top 1/100th of 1% of the people of America. And sadly, a lot of the elected officials are way down that list. It's just not on their radar screen. And I can tell you, it wasn't on my radar screen either until Maria King, who, you can wave, Maria. Hey, Maria. Until Maria, 2 years ago, came to me and said, Brian, you've got to do something about this. And I said to her, hey, Maria, my job is sewers and buses and roads and police, and why am I getting involved in world trade? And over the course of time, I became aware of the fact, as you are becoming aware of the fact, that world trade is going into the backyard of every single community of the world. And in fact, the day is not far away from the point where every local government is going to have a lawyer experienced in international trade and treaties before they can pass a law. And I don't have to tell you that this is going to have a chilling effect on local governments that already can be buffaloed and bluffed by people in the business community threatening lawsuits. They're already that way. And when you add a whole new layer of regulation, we got to start talking about it in those terms. When we start adding a whole new layer of regulation onto local government, and we have our local governments having to understand treaties, then I think we can move that debate into a different place and maybe get some new allies. Before I prepared for tonight, Maria gave me a whole big stack of things to read. And that's one of the problems with this issue, is that there is so much to read and there's so much detail that if you don't watch it, you can get mired down in all the detail, and you could become totally worthless in terms of being able to communicate to almost anybody except yourselves. But for some of you that do want to have an efficient place to learn about this stuff, I want to give you some citations. We're in a college after all. And so here are a few things these are kind of Brian's picks for how to get beneath the superficial and learn some things about this issue without being totally mired down in detail. The first document is Cornell International Law Journal. That doesn't sound like something that is an easy read, but it really is. And it's called Sovereignty by Subtraction. Sovereignty by Subtraction, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. And that's Cornell International Law Journal. Another document is Federalism and Foreign Investment. Federalism and Foreign Investment. And that's by Robert Stumberg from Georgetown University Law Center.
Repeat all this, it's going too fast.
All right. Robert Stumberg, S-T-U-M-B-E-R-G, Georgetown University Law Center. And you can reach him at Stumberg, S-T-U-M-B-E-R-G, at law.georgetown. All small case. Another document is the Western Governors Association report. Western Governors Association report entitled The MAI Potential Effects on State and Local Government. Good document. And then finally, a working paper. Yes, you bet. It's the Western Governors Association report entitled MAI Potential Effects on State and Local Government. And the last citation I'll give you, and there, of course there's a million of them, is by Howard Munn, M-U-N-N, who's with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. International Institute for Sustainable Development. There's a working paper, NAFTA's Chapter 11 on the environment. And these are some documents that Maria suggested to me. I've read them. They're good, solid things to read. And they're pretty practical as well. And I'd strongly recommend them to you. I want to, now that I've taken all the energy out of the room with details, I want to do several things with you over the next few minutes. First of all, I want to talk to you about 5 devilish details. As you know, the devil's in the details. And we're going to talk about 5 of those in a practical way where you can understand them and where we can all understand them. Then I'm going to talk to you about sort of the effect of this agreement and these various agreements on the way government operates in the general sense, because there's a lot of intangible effects on your government that you may not have thought of. Then we're going to talk about the big picture of world trade and peace and those sorts of things very briefly, because I think there needs to be more clear thinking about this whole thing. And finally, I want to give you some suggestions for your personal strategy on what you as individuals can do if you want to engage this whole problem in a way that's doable for those of us that are making livings or going to school. First of all, those 5 details. In this country, government doesn't have the right to regulate things or regulate private property just automatically. That right derives from 200 years of interpretations of the Constitution. And one of those issues is an issue called the takings. Takings. And that is to say that if I am an individual and I own property, and if the government passes a law that reduces the value of my property, whether it's land or whether it's some other property, or takes that property away from me to where I no longer can enjoy the use of that property, then that's a takings, and according to our Constitution, you're entitled to compensation for the market value of that property. That's deep in our constitutional law. Well, the courts have interpreted takings over the last 80, 90 years in various ways. And I'll read you some language from the Supreme Court in which in 1993 they reaffirmed their doctrine of what a taking is. And it read as follows: the Supreme Court, our cases, have long established that mere diminution in the value of property, however serious, is insufficient to demonstrate a taking. What that means is that government can reduce the value of your property to some degree, provided there's a rational basis, provided it meets certain other legal tests. And you are not entitled to compensation unless you lose all enjoyment of that property, unless you lose all that value. Now, and this has been developed over the course of the last 70 or 80 years of judicial law. It's well established. Under NAFTA and under the MAI and under the trade agreements that we're talking about, that definition of a taking could be redefined, and probably would be. And it would not be redefined by Supreme Court justices that are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. They would be determined by these tribunals, by these decisions, by these secret folks that go into rooms and come out with these edicts. And if they reinterpret the takings clause and they interpret it in a broader way to where any loss of value can be a taking, then that's going to have a rippling effect across the wide range of actions that governments take. So that's one detail. A second detail is the impairment clause. There's a clause in the MAI, and this is part of what's being negotiated currently in the WTO, that would prohibit the, quote, impairment of the operation, management, maintenance, and use of a foreign investment. Now, let's look at that. Over the last 70 years, our courts have determined that government can pass a regulation if there's a rational basis, and that basis has to be related to the police powers of the state or to health and safety standards and powers that government has. We can't do things arbitrarily. Government can't do that. But if there's a rational basis, we can pass that law. It is the NAFTA provisions go way beyond rational basis. Even if you have a rational basis, NAFTA says that you can't impair the operation, management, maintenance, and use of a foreign investment. If that gets approved in the MAI, that will extend that problem. That means that the mere fact that there is an infringement, even if it's rational, even if it's based on public health and safety, could be potentially thrown out. Another detail you got to look for. The third detail is moving us away from prohibitions about outright discrimination and moving us toward de facto discrimination. In other words, currently there are laws and treaties, there's treaties that establish that local governments cannot on their face pass laws that discriminate between foreign corporations and local corporations. NAFTA has those provisions, which means that if you pass a law that specifically addresses and says, that if you're from this country, you fall under these conditions. If you're from this country, you fall under different conditions. But the danger of what's happening now is that there are negotiations to move that into de facto discrimination. In other words, the fact that a foreign corporation is positioned differently, maybe they have had a history of making different kinds of investments, or maybe they have different labor force, or maybe they have whatever it is, they are in a certain position where the action that the government is taking could discriminate against them, not intended, but unintentionally, but could discriminate against that corporation or that country and their corporations. That would be prohibited under the agreements that are being contemplated by the WTO. So moving us away from discriminating on outright discrimination and moving us toward de facto discrimination prohibitions, that's a big deal. Another issue I want to mention to you is the local exemption. There are provisions in many of these treaties wherein local governments can be exempted from some of the provisions for laws they already have on the books. Well, a lot of people look at that and say, well, see, there's our protections. The question you've got to ask is do you really want to freeze forever throughout the life of these treaties? Do you want to freeze all of the regulations that your local governments have on the books? The exemption clauses are not sufficient to protect your local government's authority to protect the public health and safety and welfare. And then the last detail I want to give you deals with the issue of punitive damages versus proportional to actual damages. Now, our courts have established the doctrine in this country that individuals can sue corporations and can get punitive damages. And there does not have to be a relationship to actual damages if there is a potential for a deterrent. In other words, you sue a corporation for a lot more money than your damage because that creates a deterrence so that future corporations are less likely to be sloppy in the way they protect the public. Under these international agreements, under NAFTA and under the MAI, there would be a prohibition against these punitive damages, and there would have to be the damages would have to be limited to actual damages, and that potentially would undermine many years of our judicial rulings that have created an atmosphere in which corporations have a built-in incentive to be responsible. So those are 5 details that I wanted to give you, partly because if I didn't, Maria would kill me because she didn't want me to just give my general shtick. And secondly, because when you're talking about these trade agreements, you have to have a proper mix of detail and generality. And I think that these are some concrete problems with these international agreements that are widely recognized by lawyers, and which the general public needs to get a grip on it so that you can understand the insidious way in which these treaties are undermining our whole rule of law in this country. I want to go now to just briefly about the effect of these agreements on our governmental culture, if you will. I can tell you that it may be a surprise to you, but legislative bodies are not particularly rational. Nick will tell you that politics and perception is often far more important than the substance of what's being debated. That's why it's so frustrating to the public looking in, who sees decisions being made in a seemingly irrational manner, and they say, why is this happening? And they don't realize that really politics and perception and relationships are what drives legislation all too often. And the potential of adding a whole new element to the way local governments make decisions is something we should all be concerned about. If, for example, somebody passes a law, votes for it, and supports it, and it turns out later that it's determined that it violated international law, it violated an international treaty, then that would be extremely embarrassing. I remember in 1990, when I was first elected and we were doing land use, making land use decisions, I had the audacity to go out and actually look at a piece of ground that I was going to vote on. Well, it turned out that that was an ex parte communication with the land, I guess. It was really strange. And our prosecuting attorney advised the whole council that this was something that we probably shouldn't do. And they had a reason for that. But the front page of the local paper said, Derdowski gets legal reprimand. I mean, it was that big. And the next day, the prosecuting attorney wrote a letter saying, no, it's not true. He didn't get a reprimand. Wait a minute, that's ridiculous. But that was about that big. But the damage was done. Now, you could imagine somebody in an elected office who votes for something, and then the headline says, Derdowski's law violates international law, violates treaty. U.S. government pays $100 million because of Brian's screw-up. The Times would write that headline. Mindy Cameron would approve it. The potential for that risk will have a chilling effect on governments taking proper action. Enough said. Secondly, it is common practice for people who can hire lawyers to bluff government by saying that if you don't do this, we're going to sue you. Or they'll come in with these Brandeis briefs with all of this documentation and snow the elected officials and make them believe that they have to do a certain thing. Well, that's another way that in a very insidious way, these international treaties are going to have an effect on what local governments do. Okay, I want to move on to the next thing, which is the big picture. Now, here I get out on limbs because, you can get real deeply philosophical about all this. But I can remember reading in newspapers some years ago about how other governments in the country in the world were discriminating against American goods by using backdoor methods. The Japanese were often cited as the worst offenders, where what they did is rather than just outright banning American products, they would set up a whole system of barriers that were sort of integrated into their whole system, and it had the cumulative effect of banning the imported goods. Now I looked at that, and as did a lot of people that were concerned about balance of payments, and said, yes, we've got to solve this problem. But the problem is the solution is far worse than the original problem. Because the problem is quite simple. If a foreign corporation is not accepting American goods because of practices that America thinks is wrong, then America can institute tariffs. And that's and it's quite clean, and it's quite clear, and it's quite effective. But under this new regime, the tariff would be implicit in the system, and the taxpayer will pay for it. Under a system where governments impose tariffs, who pays the tariff? The corporation, not the government. Government doesn't pay the tariff. The person that's selling the product, the corporation that's selling the product, doesn't sell as much of that product, right? Or the corporation that buys the product has to pay more for that product. The taxpayer doesn't pay tariffs. Corporations pay tariffs. This whole thing, these international trade agreements are a way of taking the private costs of tariffs and putting it up to the taxpayers so they wind up paying it. How's that for a different way of looking at this issue? Tell that to your taxpayer friends. Here's another thought for you, and that is that the reason America did not impose tariffs on Japan was because America felt it was in the best interest of the world for there to be a stable, productive Japan. There were other factors that added to it. It wasn't just a question of dollars. It was a question of relationships. It was a question of political relationships. And those other concerns had a tendency to moderate the decisions that were being made. Because you know something? It ain't all money. Money isn't everything. And that sometimes you do things that cost you money because it's the right thing to do. Now, when we institute a worldwide system in which anybody, any corporation, purely on financial motivation, can go into the system and force governments to write checks, they will have no policy impediment to doing it. They won't do it because they want to have a good relationship with Japan. They will do it because there's a financial need, and they're going to meet that need. I believe that over time, this is going to lead to resentments. And that over time, we will actually destabilize the world in ways that we're not contemplating today. Because there will not be that overarching policy objectives that will tend to moderate the relationship between nations. Imagine if American corporations start winning a whole bunch of suits against some country that's important to us. That will could have a terrible effect. I mean, talk about the ugly American. And it's not American corporations that are the whole problem here at all. There will be increasing resentments against the rights of corporations wherever they're from. Third thing is the issue of whether the world will be more stable. The argument goes that if you don't trade, and I've heard Pat Davis say this, that if you don't trade goods, you trade guns. You know, you start shooting at each other. If trade doesn't go across the borders, bullets will. Well, to a degree, that's true. But we have managed to have a lot of trade without these agreements. There's been a lot of trade. And so there's other ways of approaching a world that has interlocking relationships and cultural exchange and trade exchange. But the question we've really got to ask ourselves is that what seems to you to be more stable? A world in which no nation is self-sufficient and can actually take care of itself, or a world in which a lot of nations can take care of themselves? Do you know, imagine this. Imagine, you know what we do for oil. Imagine if we didn't make any shoes in this country. No shoes at all. None. And let's say that periodic table, let's say vanadium, a new country called vanadium. A new country called vanadium in the great new world of world trade evolves to the point where it's the best darn shoe maker in the world. It can make shoes for 25 cents because it's really efficient. And all the corporations have dumped all their resources into vanadium to make shoes. And they're real good at making shoes because that's the bold new world, right? Money goes to where it's efficient. Now I tell you this, if a dictator takes over vanadium, we're going to be sending F-22s in for shoes. Because I tell you what, if you can invade the Middle East for oil, 250 million barefoot Americans are going to demand action. The fact is, now that may seem like a humorous example, but all of those people in Mexico that are losing their farms and are moving into cities that can't accept them because of competition from American corn, among other things, is that creating a more stable Mexico or a less stable Mexico? Yeah. These are some thoughts. When people talk to you about the big picture, be concerned about that. And you know, a lot of corporate managers, you know, there's a big difference between corporations and their managers. It's really amazing. You know, I'm an environmental advocate. I fight developers, I fight urban sprawl, and you know, that's what I do. And I'm opposed. And so if you're Safeco, if you're, you know, Chafee Homes, if you're all these different developer types, you don't like me for the most part. And some of the big corporations don't either because they kind of have a grow at any cost mentality. But I'll tell you a big secret. A lot of their managers support me, and that's why I win elections. Because a lot of their managers live in these nice places that they want to protect. And there's a conflict between their corporate position and their personal position. And it's the same thing here with world trade. The fact is those people that are the collaborators, that are extolling the virtues of world trade, they also live here. And they also have a stake in the way our culture operates. And we need to bring them into the fold, and I think they will come into the fold over time. These corporate, you know, I mean, it's easy to attack corporations, but corporations are made up usually of hundreds of people that are pretty much like you and I. And we've got to bring these people into this discussion as people, not as employees of their corporations. Okay, I want to give you some personal strategies for what you can do. The first thing to do is don't go on vacation on November 30th. Don't do it. Tell your friends to stay in town. And you stay in town because it's going to be a heck of a party. Okay, we're going to check this off now. This is Brian's checklist here. Don't go on vacation. Number 2, get basic information and know it pretty well. Don't get too mired down in the detail so you become worthless. That little handbook, you know, the handbook with the monster, that's a good thing to read. Okay. You know, put that in your pocket, put it in your glove compartment. But get basic information so that you can talk somewhat intelligently about it. Next thing is prepare several different arguments for people, depending on the audience you're talking to. You need to have something to tell environmentalists. There's a lot of them in this town. I'm one of them. You got to have something to tell people that are members of labor unions. You got to have something to tell people that are concerned about social justice. And you also have to have, and this is something we need to do more of, you got to have something to tell conservatives. Now I tell you, I went to, I'm going to totally screw up my, my credibility with you by telling you I'm a Republican. That's right. But you know, I tell you something. The, you know, as a matter of fact, if you were a salesperson and your manager came up to you and said, listen, you got 10% of the market over here and 90% of the market over here, what territory would you pick? Just think about that. But in any case, I went over to the picnic, the Republican picnic on Vashon Island. And you know, this is a place where Republicans typically give rah-rah speeches about beating up Democrats. And I went to the Democratic picnic too. And that's the place where Democrats talk about picking on Republicans. And when I was in front of that Republican audience, I decided that in my 3 minutes of glory, I was going to tell them about the WTO. And what I told them was that don't you let environmentalists and labor unions be the only ones to stand up for America. And what happened was chilling. Well, I mean, it sent a chill down my spine. They responded big time. Because the fact is that conservative Republicans love America and the Constitution and freedom every bit as much as you do. Every bit as much as you do. They see things a little differently. But they're important. And they should be allies. And they'll come around. And we've got to be able to talk to them. And we've got to be able to create forums in which they don't feel like an outsider. And that's part of what we need to accomplish. So you all need to be able to learn how to talk to conservatives. Okay. And in some ways, I'm conservative. There are some issues that you'd look at me and say, I don't agree with you, Brian. As a matter of fact, I vote against every one of my supporters at one time or the other. They don't vote for me because I agree with them all the time. They vote for me for a whole bunch of other reasons. And we try to build bridges with people. Okay, next thing is write letters to the editor. It's the cheapest form you've got. And don't just send it to the Times and the PI. Send it to the Woodinville Weekly. Send it to the Valley Record in Snoqualmie. You can get an easy list of all the different newspapers, and don't just send it to the Tacoma News Tribune. Send it all over the place. Make them simple and straightforward, and send a letter to Spokane and talk to them about what the WTO is going to do to farm produce. That's what we need to be doing. That's the people's court. That's the people's forum, is these letters to the editor. We need to start doing that. Next is you need to out your local officials. I tell you what, there's a lot of collaborators in this town. And they will, and this is a Democratic county. And you have got to make something stick. And that is that if the so-called progressive politicians in this town, whether they're county executive or mayor or congresspeople or in the House or wherever they are in the state, you've got to tell them this, that if they go schmooze with all these people and they go to the fancy parties and they get all glassy-eyed about trade, and if they don't stand up to the Seattle Times, and if they don't continually talk about fairness, about labor rights, about environmental rights, about the public health and safety, about protecting the environment, if they are not the conscience of this whole region while they're going to those parties, that you will never elect another stamp for him, that you will unelect him, that you'll vote for a Republican if you have to. At least once. You got to make it stick. And you got to do it now. Because these people are schmoozing. Because they know, the Democrats in this town know, that you got no place to go. So if they collaborate with business, they're okay. They're building their base. You've got to tell them that you're going to punish them. And you really have to make it stick. There is such a thing. Let me tell you, I know from experience, there is such a thing as a primary. And every single Democrat should have a tough primary opponent if on November 30th they're not in the streets with the people. Don't you dare let those people win a Democratic primary if they're not in the streets with you. Don't you let them do it. Okay, now, having said that, we're going to make peace. We're going to make peace with our buddies and our friends, the Ron Judds of the world. That's right. The fact is that in this town, your power isn't as powerful as organized labor. Most of you in this room are involved in social justice issues and all sorts of things. But organized labor is the ticket to the big game when it talks about politics. And they have to play the cards. Anytime you have power, the more power you get, the less freedom you have to exercise that power. That's the way it works in this country. And that means that you have a bigger picture. And you have to be concerned because you got to live to fight another day. And so if you have no power, it's easy to be a purist. Okay? And I've been a purist in times in my life. And it's nice to do it, and it's fun, but it sometimes gets in the way of changing the world. And so throughout this battle, you got to remember that a 75% friend is a whole lot better than a 90% enemy. And so your friends in labor and your friends in the environment and some of those folks that are really on your side in the activism world, you need to forgive them a little bit because they have to play their cards carefully. I don't think that you should let elected officials straddle this fence. They know better, and you got to hold them accountable. But anytime you build a big movement like this one, you're going to have disagreements about everything from the color of stationery to what the best strategy is. And you can't let that tear yourselves up. Don't let your power get diminished and split up because you don't agree with each other. You got to have solidarity. That was such a good line. We're going to close on it. You got to have solidarity.
Well, greetings. It's been probably a long evening. It's been a very informative one. I learned a lot from listening to Ellen, and I always learn a lot when I talk. And I listened to Brian as well. And of course, he did give out one of the secrets that legislative bodies aren't rational. I don't know. So that now everybody knows that we're irrational. I'm not going to be in fact, I'm not going to go into the details of GATS or the WTO. I'm going to give you my thoughts on what I see happening in the city in a broader perspective as well. And I will make a short plug. I did pass around a sign-up sheet two of them actually, called Urban Politics, the email I put out. So if it's wandering around somewhere, if someone has it, eventually it ended up in this corner, so I can get them back. There they are. Great, thank you. You know, in looking at the newspapers' editorials, it's sort of interesting to see how they perceive the people in this room and a lot of things that we're talking about. Often, it appears that they're always leading the articles by saying, what's wrong with these people? Are they anarchists? Are they nuts? Don't they understand that Seattle is one of the leading regions in the nation that's dependent on trade? And they point to the agriculture products coming through our port and Microsoft and Boeing. And in fact, a lot of people here probably even work for corporations that, or businesses that do business overseas. And it is a very integrated economy nationally and locally. I was just reading the other day, for instance, sort of interesting that the latest Boeing jet, the 777, actually it's manufactured in 12 different countries and then eventually put together here. And so with the national economy expanding, and it has been expanding for the last 8 years, if you look at the newspapers, you hear a number of arguments that are made for like why things are great. Locally, they point out that, and it's just pull these out of the headlines, it's sort of interesting. They say salaries 34% higher now than in the last 5 years, even after adjusted for inflation. They point out that unemployment is the lowest in 3 decades. And nationally, they point out that the jobless rate is the lowest since 1969, and the median family incomes are at an all-time high. Now, I think it's important not to run away from those kinds of numbers, but to look at them and ask yourselves, what's going on here? And you look locally, and you find out that there's a tremendous lack of affordable housing. There are virtually no market rate apartments for those families earning 30% or less of the median family income. And the rental cost in the last few years has been going up at twice the rate of inflation. That right now in Seattle, and it has been for the last 10 years, over 2,000 citizens are homeless and sleeping on the streets. And that's one thing that we are not going to do, I will not allow, is that we sanitize this city for the WTO conference. If we have homeless people, we should take care of them now, not just for 2 days out of the year. These needs create tremendous pressures on local governments. Right now, Seattle is probably one of the cities that subsidized housing more than, probably within the top 5 cities in the country. And yet, we've just made a dent. In talking to housing advocates, if we were to actually have a program to house all the homeless in Seattle, it'd probably approach $1 billion just building enough housing. And this all ties in because when you look at what's going on locally also regarding this expanding economy, because part of the reason people's median income is going up is because they're having more than one job. They have 2 jobs and sometimes 3 jobs. And they're working more hours. They're driving more too. And everyone talks about the traffic congestion, but within the last decade, vehicle miles traveled has grown 3 times the amount of the population. Think about it. Everyone's driving madly, working more jobs, trying to pay the bills. And then our response is we're trying to build sound transit, which is now over $200 million in debt for a rail system that it looks like it's not going to work. Nationally, the same problems are seen. In fact, just this past week, the New York Times had an article using information that was produced from the Congressional Budget Office, pointing out that the gap between the rich and the poor has grown into an economic chasm so wide that right now the top 1% will have as many after-tax dollars, after they pay their taxes, to spend as much as 40% of the population, 100 million people. And that ratio has doubled since 1977. Data shows that the income disparity has grown so much that 80% of the households are taking home a thinner slice of the economic pie than they did in 1977. That's the flip side of the positive information you hear the first time. And median families are increasing, sure, but more than 90% of that increase is going to the richest 1%. Now, internationally, it's going on as well. We know, for instance, the poorest nations are getting poorer. And interesting enough, even the PI editorial the other day recognized that WTO, the way it's currently organized, is a disadvantage for the poor countries. What they didn't mention is that more than 1 out of every 5 countries that belong to the WTO cannot afford to send a delegate to the headquarters in Geneva. And I'm wondering is how many of those countries will not be able to send delegates to the ministerial that's here. I imagine there'll be a number of those poor countries who won't even be at the table. Now, pretty much the recognition, certainly amongst the people here, is that the increased concentration of wealth, economic power, politics, has been as a result of a trend of corporatization, particularly multinational corporates dominating the agenda. And the most recent example was the MAI, and I won't go into the impact because I think Brian did an excellent job of pointing out a lot of the problems. I, along with Peter Steinbrück and Richard Conlon on the City Council, we passed a resolution opposing the MAI because of because it would restrict the city's ability to do a number of things. For instance, we tried to get a ordinance passed here to stop the city from trading with Burma, and we failed, but a number of other cities, in fact every major city that's gone to this has passed except Seattle, but a number of counties and states have done the same thing, and right now it's being challenged. I think Massachusetts, because of their restraint on trade with Burma. If the WTO passes the kind of same kind of trade restrictions that were encapsulated in MAI, we might still have apartheid in South Africa because it was due to economic boycotts that eventually allowed Nelson Mandela and the majority of the people in South Africa to be free, as well as looking at the environment, the impact and restrictions on the environment. As was mentioned earlier, the lawsuit on attacking the nation's Clean Air Act from Venezuela because of gasoline. Now, all of this activity by the corporations has been dressed up around the words of free trade. I like the word free because we all identify with freedom and free. But I think it's important for us to make a distinction between obviously free trade and fair trade and also global trade. Global trade will go on. It's critical that it goes on. We all can't be self-sufficient countries. And in fact, I just met with the Cuban delegation this past week, which we invited him to come to Seattle, Fidel Castro, the president in particular. And the Cuban delegation wants to trade with the United States. They have an embargo going on right now. Some of you may have been, in fact, at the demonstrations trying to get the embargo lifted from Iraq so that there can be trade with Iraq. So trade itself, in and of itself, is not bad. Countries need trade. The question is whether it's fair trade or free trade. And free trade has come to be defined as basically free of restraints on the exploitation of labor or the environment. And whether it's child labor or whether it's the elimination of forests, the last of the natural forests in the country, we need to keep in mind that what's happening is with free trade, it's also the free movement of capital around the world. And capital has become very, very fluid. The volume of foreign direct investment has quadrupled in the last 15 years. And capital now can choose literally between 20 different markets, labor markets, whereas labor markets are geographically based. They're limited in where they can go. And as a result, that corporations now are creating, as someone pointed out, a one world, trans-corporate agenda that will, and it's going on now, shape the ability of nations or their subdivisions, whether it's municipalities or states, to control their environment and their culture and their work condition. And it's not just American corporations. In fact, in 1971, close to 60% of the world's 500 largest multinational corporations were American-based. In 1991, it was only 33%. So we're talking about international corporations now that are truly international, outside the U.S. And in this new one world that we're looking at in the corporate world, the primary important player now is a stockholder as opposed to the voter in a country. And corporations are responsible to stockholders, and that stockholders are, in fact, how much stock you own. And it's a question of transferring sovereignty, the question of sovereignty from one person, one vote, to the sovereignty of how many dollars you have, and that's how many votes you have. And as a result, as was pointed out by our first speaker, then we have the votes of corporations deciding that the votes of citizens, as in Canada, that they want a national health care, should not be that type of health care, but the votes of a corporation decide that they prefer a different kind of health care. This tension is what I see as the traditional tension between government authority and commercial activities or corporate authority. And this shift is taking place locally as well, because unless we begin to educate not just ourselves, but the general public, of the change in this format from democracies, from the basic idea of governments, we have votes and citizens as being primary, as opposed to corporations where we have stockholders and investments being primary, we will see, as the two previous speakers have pointed out, the ability of local government to have less and less control over our environment, whether it's trying to put double hulls on tankers coming into the Sound, whether it's trying to enact the Endangered Species Act to save salmon in this area, or whether it's to limit the kinds of autos that we want driven in our area for auto emissions. I want to say basically that when it comes down to November 30th, I think what's critical is that the City of Seattle make sure that there's ample opportunity for all the citizens of Seattle to express themselves, to be there, and for the leaders of Seattle's government to be in the streets, but as well as to create as many opportunities to create major public forums and to get the word out to the general public. I think our basic message is that we want to say that democracies support fair trade, not a trade that squelches the rights of workers or tears up our environment or endangers the health of our citizens. And that as long as we can get that message across, I think that this WTO conference, this coming fall, will set a new standard throughout the world as far as the ability of citizens to influence the future shape of the world. Thank you.